My name is Yuan. So today I'm going to talk about UX for vulnerable users. So who's vulnerable? If you look up on the internet, there are obviously lots of different definitions, but for the purpose of our presentation, they can include adults who are at risk of harm or who lack what we consider basic human skills, human life skills, potentially people with a disability. Again, I'm not saying that someone with a disability is definitely vulnerable, but it can include people with a disability. And that's, in this case, one of the case study I'm talking about is people with autism spectrum disorder, and deafness. And, as well as people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Again, I'm careful not to kind of, apply with a broad brush through lots of different people. Disadvantaged backgrounds can mean socioeconomic or educational, so literacy as well. So what is in common is that vulnerable people may require assistance, sometimes from the government, in areas such as housing, employment, education, socialization, and family support. So they need some help as well. So a little bit about us and myself. So I'm a co-founder of Yump, and we specialize in user experience, particularly website transformation for lots of not-for-profit organizations. We do work outside of not-for-profit, but it's an area that we have a lot of experience in. And the reason how we found ourselves in the position was that I used to work with the other co-founder, Simon, for another digital agency about 5 years ago. In a very short time period, they fired all their not-for-profit clients because they were not making very good business, fortunately for them. But we're like, they also need a designer and developer. And so despite the fact that we lost our jobs, we went in and pitch for those clients, and then we started working with these amazing organizations, and so it's been part of our DNA from day one that we exist to help them generate more engagement, more impact, and which leads to more funding. So some of the organizations that we've helped so far, today in particular, I'm going to be talking about Autism Spectrum Australia, MacKillop Family Services, and Expression Australia. I don't know how much you know about them, but pretty cool. So first one is MacKillop Family Services. They're a integrated service provider based predominantly in Melbourne, so in Victoria. Although they have a presence in Victoria, New South Wales, and Western Australia, a lot of these service providers receive some kind of funding from the government, whether it's the Commonwealth or state or federal. And they have an Australian presence, but they generally tend to be focused in a particular state with some other, say, branches in the other states. So in the case of MacKillop, at the core of the organization, it's about empowering children and families through believing every child deserves the best. And then Autism Spectrum Australia, we're currently working through the project with them. They're Australia's largest service provider for people on the spectrum. So their purpose is to understand, engage, and celebrate their strengths and diversity. And they're predominantly based in New South Wales with a really good presence in the other states as like Victoria and the ACT as well. And then finally, the last case study that I'll be talking about is for Expression Australia. It's still kind of early in the project, but I think they're really relevant in the topic today, what we're talking about. So Expression Australia used to be known as VicDeaf. So you might know VicDeaf or the Victorian Deaf Society. So that's actually their new tagline, which is Ambassadors of Human Potential. So they're champion of deaf culture and Auslan, which is a sign language. So they're delivering specialized services to what people would consider the general disability sector. But what's really interesting about these three organizations is their people are all individually different, in really kind of unique and challenged in their own ways. And what we've discovered is when we work with them, I say we have developed a new sense of empathy for people who are very different from us in some ways, and not in other ways, of course. So I hope that everyone here might have know something about the NDIS and what that has meant for lots of Australians. is that when the NDIS came on board, I think it's 2017 or 16 or 17, it means that when it's fully rolled out, so it hasn't been fully rolled out yet. I think it's in the stages of being rolled out across Australia. I believe Western Australia hasn't happened yet. But when it's fully rolled out, it will provide almost 500,000 Australians who have permanent and significant disability with funding for support and services. So what this has done for the disability sector in general is put the power in the people's hands. And so this quote is something I found that kind of explains it really well. What the NDIS did is that the NDIS, this is back then before it started rolling out, would throw open the market as the government shifts from block funding services to an individual fee for service arrangement. So the idea is that the shackles are off. You, as in these organizations who provide these services, can deliver as much as they can provide, essentially. And so instead of having waiting lists, now you can go for it. But whereas before then, it was all about how good you are lobbying the government. So that what that has done is created a very competitive landscape that didn't exist beforehand. So many of these organizations that we work with started realizing that they need to be competitive and need to think about the user, where previously it was more about, things happening behind the scenes. So now they've put the user right at the center of the experience. And so that's the way they think about how they appeal to their customers and their clients have completely changed as soon as the NDI started rolling out. And we're still seeing a little bit of lag, is that it's been in the market for a while. It's still in the stages of rollout. And the organization is going, I'm still trying to convince everyone to see it my way. So I think that's definitely a change coming, which is great for everyone who works in the UX space, because we've been talking about this from day one, right? Put the user at the center of designing experience, and finally we can see that these organizations are embracing that as well, which is great. So I would put it out there that I'm not necessarily an accessibility specialist or an expert. And so today I'm really interested more about inclusive design, and that it's more, whereas I think in accessible design, that's sometimes more about meeting a certain sense of criteria, whereas I think inclusive design is more about, it's a methodology, which in this case enables and draws on a full range of human diversity. It means including and learning from people with a range of perspectives. And it starts with seeing human diversity as a resource for better designs. So I think in my experience, more as an approach rather than necessarily meeting a certain standard. So an inclusive design isn't necessarily accessible, but it's the approach that we take. So actually, I'll do this. Inclusive, so this quote is great. Inclusive design doesn't mean you're designing one thing for all people. You're designing a diversity of ways to participate so that everyone has a sense of belonging. So we can take this a little bit further and try to kind of focus on kind of what makes inclusive design different. As this quote from Kat Holmes, I think she's a former design director at Google. Funny enough that you keep mentioning Gmail. And so she's a UX design director, and she has a quote about inclusive design. It's about including excluded communities in the design process, not marketing to people with disability. So the question is, have you involved someone in your design process who was previously unable to participate? And how you get there is what makes it inclusive, not that it's targeted at an underrepresented community. So what we try to do as an UX agency is we try to carry that philosophy to the way that we interact with our clients, really encouraging them to include users in the design process, which would have been too easy to exclude. Especially when you're working with organizations who may think very commercially about who's making the financial decision about where to spend money. And so the idea of convincing them to step out of that sometimes to include a wider form of perspective in the design process can be quite challenging. And again, I'm not saying that we've done it right or we've done it perfectly, but here's just some examples of how we try to go about doing it. and what we've learned in the process. So starting with MacKillop Family Services, MacKillop believes every child deserves the best. They're passionate about supporting families and children to thrive. So some of the challenges, and you'll find it's quite similar across organizations like MacKillop. So we started working with them about a year ago. The website was launched last year. So what we do as an agency is we usually we take them from start to end. So just enough research, design, build, testing, all of that, launch the site, all of that through the whole website transformation process. So their challenges were not positioned well in a competitive landscape, doesn't reflect their full scope of services, lack of understanding of user behavior, lack of integration, clunky management system, a lot of the problems that we're familiar with. So just to give you an idea of the kind of services they offer, so that you have a better insight into what they do for the people that they support. So we kind of picked those categories are what they have currently on the site, but some examples of that would be, for example, a accommodation for young people who have been in contact with the juvenile justice system who can't find a place to stay. It could be supporting children with a disability to develop the skills that they need to live the best possible life. So here are some examples, and there's also another one which is really important, which makes them quite unique as an organization, is the Sanctuary model. So they're really proud of the Sanctuary model, where they inform organizations and schools with the tools to create communities who are better informed about trauma. So people who have experienced adversity in their life, which could include some kind of, it could be abuse, it could be, some kind of trauma in their life. And so how are we more aware of that, and how can we better provide for those communities? We went through kind of, like I said, a just enough research process where we kind of try to discover their range of different user groups that they have and kind of pick out some of the top ones, which is obviously, client service users. So these are people who may or may not be eligible for NDIS, referrers, job seekers. I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into them in the next slide. So our process in the UX side was conducting interviews and usability testing with 3 particular groups that we wanted to focus on. As with anything, there's budget, there's restraint. So we would like to have involved everyone, but to a particular, we kind of draw a line at a particular point. So in this case, we interview carers. So these are people who are usually primary carers of a child with a disability, often single parents with lower income, and they may or may not be eligible for NDIS funding, because that's a kind of a process to work out whether you're actually eligible. And their primary point of, say, human relationship with the organization are these people called case managers. So they are, they call support workers, but the case managers are really kind of the people who really look after them. And so they have a very strong, say, emotional and attachment to case managers. Whereas referrers are potentially, there are many types of different referrers, but some of the most common ones are working for other government agencies who may have a client like that and go, yep, I think MacKillop is the best provider to provide those services in a particular area. And some of them are also, they call local area coordination. They're part of the NDIS program. And then with MacKillop, they're also quite focused on donors who are individual donors. So usually these are people with a personal connection to their cause. So maybe have a very strong, maybe a personal connection to children or people who have suffered trauma, and they want to donate to an organization that supports people in that area. So some of the quotes one little quote that I picked out over the usability testing process is, that my eyes glaze over the services, but I usually find myself making a call to the head office just to get to specific information that they think are missing. So imagine the number of hours burnt by customer support and handling all these inquiries for information that's missing, or for all these gaps in getting to the service they need. So there's so much improvement that can be made on the UX space, a lot on these websites, in terms of streamlining services, helping people like referrers, like clients, get to services quicker. So what we learned through the MacKillop UX process was that, in fact, as much as we thought that clients were important, referrals are probably even more important. And their needs are stronger because they need to, I know whether MacKillop even has the right program in the right location for their clients. Whereas clients tend to come in, when I say clients, I mean service users. So I mean as in people who need support. They tend to lack a lot of general knowledge about NDI, so it's very confusing. So they'll be struggling more for general information about eligibility and how that will affect their access to different services. So, I'm not eligible. Does that mean I can still get to, use that service or not? One interesting thing that have come up repeatedly was this idea of a waiting period. If I don't have to wait, then I would go with this organization. So again, this is part of the making something more competitive. So if we can guarantee a shorter waiting time, then you're going to get more people coming to you. So some of the tips here are more practitioner tips about how we could have done the UX process better. So one really important thing is learning about the participant's background beforehand. So get prepared well. Try to get as much information, obviously without confidentiality issues or privacy issues, about what the background is like. So how do you adapt your interview sessions or usability testing sessions based on kind of who they are and how they might behave in a session. Because the case manager is such an important part of their life. So getting the introduction, getting them feel welcome by the case manager was a really important step in developing the initial sense of trust and rapport between the UX team and the clients. It's interesting because we're so short of time, especially in an interview. We try to squeeze as many questions in as we can. In fact, what happened in reality is that you need to allow time for conversations because these are people, and you need time to build rapport and to let them trust you so that you can ask the questions and then they'll be willing to divulge certain things that they probably wouldn't be comfortable sharing with you if they were not comfortable with you. So you're going to have time to develop that relationship even in the, say, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour session that you have with them. Because these people, I say clients can also feel that you have if you're a great listener, that now they can tell you more, they feel more comfortable. So on where possible, we try to offer empathy, but at the same time, we have a job to do. So we're going to keep them focused on the questions as well. So having that right balance is really important. And finding different ways to communicate the questions are also very important. Whether it's, visual, verbal, everyone communicates slightly differently. So not everyone is great with words like you are. And so, maybe there are different ways to communicate the same concept. Show visual, use pictures, use examples that can facilitate communication. And record everything. Really important, as you always need a backup. And just be prepared for things not to go to plan, and adjust as necessarily and adjust as you go. And that's going to come down to how experienced you are in those situations. So kind of the outcomes of it is we took them through the whole process. So just for the sake of the presentation, I'm more focused on the UX side, but obviously we did a lot of development work as well. So, design system, prototypes for testing, Craft CMS is what we built on and we love. Flexible donation pathway, lots of integrations. And then we launched it last year, which is great. You want to check it out. That's the URL. Next is Autism Spectrum Australia. So SPEC is short, it's the short name for Autism Spectrum. They're a largest service provider for people on the spectrum. So again, very similar challenges, not positioned well in a competitive landscape. Particularly their site was really outdated, was not accessible, was confusing, too many choices, poor on mobile. And what the process that we went through with that spec was again, similar to MacKillop, really understanding where the users come from. We created personas that we then actually have to validate, obviously, not just based on assumptions. And in this case, we chose to focus, before I get to that, so some of the services that so just comparing the personas. So in particular, we're going to focus on the carers of children on the spectrum, as well as adults on the spectrum. And as you can understand, the services they provide can be very broad. So this it usually starts with getting a diagnosis. That's really important. So first of all, do they have autism spectrum disorder? So I'm going to use autism use it the same as ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder. So people say autism spectrum disorder, or ASD are all kind of interchangeable words these days. So getting a diagnosis to work out whether they actually have ASD, and then they need education, and because they're different, and so they have autism. Aspect offers autism specific education for children with ASD. Therapy services, getting a job, so that's really, really important. Social and community support, so they need a lot of support when it comes to socialization, because a key part of ASD is the lack of what we consider normal communication skills. So they have issues with like eye contact, with understanding facial expression, how to communicate. And so socialization is very important, because a lot of them can be very lonely, and so needs a lot of community support. And so Aspect helps them get out there and meet people and find people like them, and basically live as great a life as possible. Attending workshops, these are usually for carers, so understanding how ASD works, and respite and short breaks. So these are really important for carers, the people who are looking after children with ASD. They need respite, they need short breaks, because it can be quite hard, can be quite challenging. So we focus particularly in the usability testing with clients or carers. So these are, again, primary carer of a child with a disability or with a child with ASD, and then as well as adults on the spectrum. So again, I have to commend the organization for taking having the courage to invite users with ASD, because they could be easily ignored, saying, well, they're probably not making their own decision, or maybe their carers will be enough. We don't really need to engage people with ASD. But I think it's a strength of the organization to say, yep, we'll definitely include them in the design process and have a process to go about doing that. And one of the ones that really took me by surprise, not say surprise, but I have to say I was probably not as educated as I could have been walking into the session. But when he said that going to the city, public transport is a lot more crowded, I find that really stressful. It took me 4 or 5 years to catch a train, and that was just going from one station to another. And that really just made me realize how much I don't understand about ASD, and how much my team doesn't really understand about ASD. And so how do we then design an experience that could help them? So some of the learnings are also maybe some general information for maybe those of you who don't know ASD that well. So people with ASD often have communication difficulties in one form or another. And as it came out again, they prefer to engage via chat, forms, or email, because they're probably not very comfortable with calling someone and talking with someone. Being interviewed is an extremely stressful experience. We did a few things, probably could have done a few things better by maybe having a different setup in the room where we made the participant feel overly stressed, which was with the experience of being interviewed or being asked to do things. And so they basically, one of them actually was visibly uncomfortable to the point where it took us a little bit too long to realize what was happening. And I said, so are you okay? He goes, can I go? I said, yes, please. So again, that's something that we learned. We could have done that better. So again, for us, it could be very simple, very normal, but for them, it could be really, really stressful. They like to see, a lot of them like to see more community stories so that they can relate more with news and events. Another thing which is really interesting is people talk about services like, oh, what service do you want to access? But in this side, we introduce this concept of life stages. So, if you're between the ages of, say, 8 to 12 or adolescents or adults, it was a concept that people inside the organization was vehemently against. they said we can't separate services by life stages. It is not how we define people. So there was a lot of arguments, but eventually we found out that actually people really like that. Like users find it really easy to relate to, so that especially if someone who maybe doesn't understand what services are on offer, the idea that I could say, oh, I'm, 25, and that's a service that's applicable to me, was like I said, was something that they discovered through the process that was actually really helpful to users. And I like the Adams talk about plain language. And in this case, I'm going to add a little bit consistent labeling. If you call something, just call it the same way throughout the site. If you call something getting a job and you got employment services, people are like, are they the same thing or not? So, just make sure that it's consistent. Some tips, again, prepare well by understanding understanding ASD. So what are the kind of behavioral, traits you have to be aware of. Always have the support worker in a room. Again, this is just like the case manager. Having that someone there that they know and that it's a safety net is so much better in the space that when we conduct any interviews or workshops or testing. And just being very aware of their body language and checking on how they feel regularly. Fidget toys are kind of like really colorful toys that help some people with ASD kind of calm their nerves. So having them nearby is kind of good. So again, just use other ways to communicate. So if verbal doesn't work, use visuals, use examples, use slides, use different ways to communicate what you want to ask. Minimize number of interviews is another one. We wish there weren't as many people in the room. So keep the numbers low. Because again, it can be very stressful. It can make them feel that they're being cornered. So they want to dash. And so, just keep the number of people in a room less if possible. Yep. And the others are the same as previously. So we're still going through the process, so stay tuned. Hopefully that will, come out in about the next 3 months. And finally, especially in Australia, so we're just kind of starting the process of working with them. But again, I think what we've learned so far, even in kind of at the beginning stage of discovery, has been really insightful for us as designers and developers. So especially in Australia, is a champion of deaf culture and Auslan, formerly known as VicDeaf. So for them, again, they're not digitally ready. Because of NDIS, it isn't clear about the website's purpose. Like, is this about services, or is this about transaction, or is this about just information? It's not accessible, and because it's actually having quite a negative business impact on them as we speak. So there's more of an urgent need to change things. So we're still working through that. As you can see with Aspect beforehand, we work with them to develop a language that's easier to understand for the everyday person. So, getting a job, social support. Whereas here, we're starting out from kind of the sub-brands. So they're not quite there yet on the plain language, but you can see how, it's more of a business kind of terminology, like, audiology and employment. But we'll get there. So it's just a process that we're working through. Again, kind of their user map that we've developed. And in this case, as the process is still quite early, and we've just kind of started with a range of different workshops. So far, what's really different about, especially in Australia, is that culturally, deaf is seen as a source. So deaf with a capital D, by the way. So be mindful of that difference, which is a culture, is a source of positive identity and pride. So deaf people don't necessarily see themselves as disabled and impaired. And this is kind of really, I think, really important. I say trait compared to when we were dealing with Aspect. So we also had the pleasure to work with Auslan interpreters. You have 2 of them if the session goes over for more than 1 hour, and you have to have lots of breaks because they have to work together to prevent mental physical fatigue. Also an OHS issue. Eye contact is really important. So, and I'll come to the tips. And what we discovered so far is that the design of the web experience has to be bilingual. And when we say bilingual, we mean English and Auslan. So unsigned, basically. And, I think that's kind of different to what people's concept of bilingual sometimes is. So what happened in this case is when we had group exercises, we shouldn't say, oh, because we want to have interpreters all in one group. So, if you're deaf, go into one group. And that's actually really rude. So what we really encourage is allowing people to organize on their own. And the interpreters will do their job, basically. Allow time for them to rest. So you need to be prepared to change the way you run your workshops and your group exercises and your interviews, because of the people who are in there are different. So don't kind of go in with this template and just do it the same way every time. So understand that the people you're working with are not necessarily just another group of kind of typical users, and understand that you need to make adjustments, so you might include more time for certain activities. And so what we've done is we were luckily very well prepared by the organization themselves, kind of giving us saying, you need to be aware of all this stuff. And so we had the ability to change the process before we started running those workshops. Maintaining eye contact with a deaf person. So again, something that I kind of had to get used to was talking to them, even though the interpreter is next to me, and so I'm, hearing one ear, but I'm maintaining my eye contact with the other person. So again, similar thread of encouraging participants to communicate in different ways. So it's okay if you don't want to write, draw to me. So again, just encouraging different types of communication and using visuals and examples. So I kind of want to wrap up just a little bit by talking about inclusive UX practice, just as a summary. I like that Adam and I went for the same toolkit, which is the Microsoft Design Toolkit Inclusive. If you know that, it's great. So here's a little explanation from the toolkit itself about what it is. It's called the persona spectrum. So it helps foster empathy to show how a solution scales to a broader audience. So no longer are we talking about a disability. We're talking about a situation or a temporary occurrence. So it's really important through inclusive design to be aware of kind of three things that you can do. First is to be able to recognize your own biases. So everyone has their own biases and assumptions. And it's really important to know that as a designer, it's our responsibility to know how our processes and designs can result in exclusion. So especially when we work with clients, we are recommending them a process or a way to design. And so we need to be aware that when we recommend that process, how we design it and how we design that process is gonna change the result. And it might result in people being excluded from the process. So how can we be more inclusive in that process? Within limited time, within limited budget, but we can do it if we try. So basically, on that note, play an active role in making our clients more aware of their own biases and assumptions. So just because marketing teams say so, or just because IT say so, doesn't mean that that's how it should run. So trying to help them also understand their own biases. Second point, so when we recognize our own biases, we can start to learn from diverse perspective. So empathy is really important in the process. We gain from having fresh and different perspective. So don't be afraid to invite someone that you might thought, oh, I'm not so sure about being in that workshop. Maybe think about the benefits of having that person or that group of people that you might, for whatever reason, because of your own biases, might think it's a bad idea. But actually having them brings fresh and interesting perspective to the problem that you're trying to solve. So recognize that we all have common motivations. So what is it that motivates us to do what we do? So if we recognize that, we can think about, we can be more open-minded about inviting a diverse representation of stakeholders and users in the process. So this is the third point. It's very similar to, I say, kind of emphasizing what Adam has talked about before, is that if you solve for one, that solution can be extended to many. A solution that works well for people who have communication difficulties, if you have a great solution for that, that's likely to benefit everyone. Because there will be different situations. People have different levels of difficulty with different things. Again, content, plain language, if someone with lower literacy can understand that benefits everyone. So our designs should be able to work across a spectrum of related abilities. And with that, thank you.